The night was silent, but silence did not mean peace. It carried weight, like a storm waiting behind the horizon. In the shadows of forgotten history, where names are erased and voices buried, lived stories that were never meant to be told. They are the stories of the unseen, the oppressed, the silenced, the ones whose suffering was painted over with the colors of power. This is not the history you were taught in classrooms. It is not the polished tale of kings, conquerors, or prophets. It is the darker truth, hidden beneath layers of denial where prejudice and power turned men into monsters and women into shadows. It is where bloodlines were divided not by worth but by skin, where children inherited not dreams but chains. And in the heart of it all stood one figure, an outcast, a symbol, a name whispered with both fear and defiance: Lilith. Her story was twisted, reshaped and buried, not because it lacked meaning but because it held too much truth. They said she was Adam's first wife, the woman who refused to bow. They said demons carried her name. They said angels cursed her, but what they did not say, what they erased, was why. Her refusal was not rebellion alone. It was resistance. Her banishment was not divine justice. It was punishment for defiance in a world built on submission. And so Lilith became a symbol not just of exile, but of every woman, every soul cast aside, for refusing to kneel before a system built on dominance. Centuries later, her echoes would mirror in the cries of slaves whose backs bent under the weight of whips, in the silence of children denied humanity, in the broken dreams of people told their worth was less because of their skin. Lilith's exile was more than myth. It was prophecy, a warning that those who refused to bow would be branded, demonized, and erased. This is where our story begins, not in the heavens, not in the myths, but in the darkness between them. Cold darkness that holds secrets of racism, injustice, and forgotten truths. It is a tale that stretches across centuries, hidden beneath holy texts, whispered in folklore and written in blood. And now that tale returns, not to comfort but to confront, to ask the questions history was too afraid to answer. What happens when truth itself is forbidden? When power rewrites the story? When those who refuse to kneel are cast into shadows? Prepare yourself, for this is not just mythology, not just history. This is the forbidden mirror of humanity, and its reflection will not let you look away. The world that birthed Lilith was not a paradise, but a cage disguised as one. Behind the golden light of creation lay shadows thick with control. The stories told of order and harmony, yet beneath them ran a current of exclusion, division, and power, masked as destiny. Lilith was born not from dust alone, but from fire that refused to be extinguished. She stood as an equal to Adam, carved not beneath him nor above him, but beside him. Yet equality was never truly permitted in the order written by those who held power. To walk beside was seen as rebellion. To claim worth without permission was seen as sin. It was here that the first fracture began, the first exile, the first silencing. For Lilith's refusal to kneel did not only challenge Adam, it threatened the very foundation of hierarchy, a system that would echo across centuries in chains, in laws, in blood spilled on soil where skin determined fate. Her banishment was not about faith, but about control. And control demands that those who resist must be erased, turned into demons in story, monsters in memory. From this silence grew a pattern that would shape humanity. Those with power claimed divine right. Those without were stripped of names, turned into shadows. Myths became weapons. Stories became chains. Lilith became the prototype for erasure, and through her entire peoples would find their defiance rewritten as evil. Centuries passed, and the same cycle repeated in countless forms. Empires rose with voices preaching equality, yet they built their walls on the backs of the enslaved. Children were marked from birth not by spirit but by skin. Families torn apart, branded as less than human. The world that claimed light carried darkness in its core, and that darkness wore the mask of justice. Lilith's story lived in whispers, carried by the forgotten, by the oppressed who saw in her exile their own reflection. Her myth became a mirror, showing the cost of defiance and the cruelty of systems that demanded obedience. But it also became a symbol, a warning that truth, when silenced, never disappears. It waits in shadows, burning quietly until the day it cannot be ignored. This is where our journey begins, not with the conquerors who wrote history, but with the outcasts who were erased from it. To understand racism, injustice, and the brutal weight of silence, one must first return to the beginning, to the myth that taught humanity how to erase those it feared. And in that beginning, Lilith stands, still banished, still silenced, still waiting to be remembered. After her banishment, Lilith did not vanish. She was forced into the shadows, branded not as a woman of strength, but as a creature of corruption. The myths called her demon, seductress, destroyer of children. But these words were not truths. They were punishments, the weapons of those who feared her defiance. When power cannot control, it must redefine. And so Lilith's identity was rewritten to serve as a warning. Obey or be cast out like her. This rewriting of truth was not unique to her alone. The same technique would echo across empires. Whole peoples were cast into the role of other. They were painted as dangerous, lazy, corrupt, savage. Labels designed to justify cruelty. Chains were fastened not only on bodies but on memory, shaping how generations would see themselves. The Eden myth became the first script, but its performance continued across continents. In Rome, conquered women were reduced to spoils, stripped of their past and renamed as property. In medieval kingdoms, faith itself was turned into a weapon, declaring entire races cursed by God. Across the oceans, millions were torn from their homes, branded not by their humanity, but by the color of their skin. Every time the powerful used the same method: demonize the defiant, erase the equal, glorify obedience. Lilith's silence is a silence shared by countless forgotten voices. She becomes not only the first wife, but the first exile, the first enslaved, the first to be rewritten by those who could not bear equality. Her refusal to kneel was transformed into wickedness. Her search for freedom was twisted into sin. And through this myth, the world learned how to justify its cruelty with stories. Yet even in silence, her story survived. Among those forced to kneel, her name was whispered as resistance. Among women who bore chains they could not break, her defiance became a secret strength. Among the enslaved whose worth was denied, she was a mirror of their stolen dignity. In every age, her presence haunted the systems built on domination. For if Lilith still existed, then so did the truth they tried to bury. The setup of history is never neutral. It always favors the hand that writes it. And so, while kings and priests recorded victories, the oppressed carried their truths in memory, song, and myth. They were not permitted to write their own history, but they wove it into survival. Lilith's story reminds us, the most dangerous weapon of injustice is not the sword but the story. And it is in stories that we now find the seeds of resistance. The silence that followed Lilith's exile was not empty. It was filled with voices twisted into lies. The powerful understood that if the people ever remembered her as equal, their entire order would collapse. And so they recast her as the enemy, a lesson for every generation. Obedience preserves paradise, resistance leads to ruin. This pattern repeated across centuries, shaping entire civilizations. Those who ruled spoke of justice while building systems of separation. They declared that some were chosen and others cursed, some destined to rule while others existed only to serve. Skin, language, and birthplace became the new tools of division. Just as Lilith had been turned into a monster for refusing submission, entire races were painted as inferior when they demanded freedom. Consider the empire that rose from Rome's ashes, spreading across continents with banners of conquest. Its laws did not speak Lilith's name, but they echoed her exile. Women, slaves, and conquered peoples were told their place was beneath, never beside. If they resisted, they too became demons in the eyes of their rulers. Later, when oceans were crossed and ships carried millions into chains, the same myth lived again. Those torn from their homelands were stripped not only of freedom, but of identity. They were told they were less than human, their resistance branded as savagery, their survival as defiance of God's order. Lilith's story shows us the root of this system. It is not simply about control of one woman in a garden. It is about the fear of equality. From that fear was born the lie that difference means inferiority, and from that lie came the centuries of blood, chains, and fire. But even lies cannot silence truth forever. In the hidden spaces of history, resistance always grew. The enslaved sang songs that carried memory when writing was forbidden. The oppressed whispered stories of survival when silence was demanded. The banished created new forms of belonging, finding strength in one another when the world denied them recognition. Lilith lived within them, not as a demon but as a reminder. Refusal to kneel is not wickedness, it is the beginning of freedom. Every setup contains the seeds of conflict, and this one is no different. Humanity has been taught to fear equality, to rewrite resistance as rebellion, to bury truth under myths of order. But the buried always rise and the silenced always return. Lilith's exile was never just hers. It was humanity's first lesson in how injustice sustains itself. To understand the darkness of racism, we must see it not as a flaw of one age, but as a system born from the beginning, perfected through myth and enforced through centuries. The stage is set. The silence is deep, and in that silence, the first sparks of defiance begin to glow. From the moment of her exile, Lilith became more than a figure of myth. She became the symbol of how power rewrites truth. What began in a garden was not just the banishment of one woman, but the creation of a system. Obedience rewarded, equality punished, resistance erased. Her story is the blueprint of injustice. Those who hold power have always feared equals, for equality threatens control. So they create myths, laws, and hierarchies to justify their dominance. They call the defiant wicked. They brand the oppressed as cursed. They turn difference into danger. And in this way, chains are forged not only from iron, but from stories. The same pattern repeats across history. Enslaved peoples in Rome, stripped of names, told they were born to serve. Women denied voice, their worth tied only to obedience. Entire nations colonized, their cultures erased, their resistance painted as savagery. Across oceans, bodies crammed into ships, identities branded away, lives reduced to labor. Each injustice carries the echo of Lilith's exile. Those who refuse to kneel must be silenced, demonized, or destroyed. But silence has never been final. In every age, the forgotten found ways to endure. They sang when speech was forbidden. They remembered when memory was outlawed. They carved hope into the smallest corners of existence, keeping alive the spark that power tried to extinguish. In their survival, Lilith lived on, not as a demon, but as a truth too dangerous to be erased. The setup of history is clear. Racism and injustice did not appear suddenly. They were seeded in the very beginning, justified through myth, perfected through empire, and carried forward through centuries. To see them is to understand that every system of oppression was built, brick by brick, on the same foundation: fear of equality. And now, with the stage set, the question becomes, what happens when the silenced refuse to remain forgotten? What fire ignites when the demonized reclaim their truth? The silence of history begins to crack. The rising action is near. The world that sought to erase Lilith's defiance now faced echoes it could not control. Across time, those who were silenced began to stir. Small acts of resistance, whispers in the dark, courage born from oppression. Every chain broken, every truth spoken, was a spark against the weight of centuries. Racism and injustice revealed themselves not only in laws or wars, but in the quiet, insidious moments, where children were denied their names, women forced into silence, entire communities told their worth was less. Lilith's shadow stretched across these centuries, a reminder that systems built on fear cannot endure forever. The oppressed learned to survive in corners, in forgotten songs, in stories passed quietly, always under watchful eyes. Yet even in hiding, their resistance grew bolder. The more the powerful tried to erase them, the more visible their courage became. Shadows lengthened, secrets festered, and the truth refused to stay buried. And in this tension the world teetered. The foundations of injustice quivered under the weight of stories long denied. Every act of defiance, no matter how small, built toward a reckoning. The silence that once suffocated now pulsed with a quiet but undeniable force, leading inevitably toward confrontation. The world trembled as the long-hidden truths broke free. Every injustice, every lie built over centuries, collided with the courage of the silenced. Lilith's defiance, once painted as sin, became a beacon, a fire that could no longer be ignored. Chains shattered under the weight of acknowledgement. Names erased for generations were remembered. The cries of the oppressed became a roar, reverberating through halls of power that had grown complacent in their dominance. Every story hidden in shadow now demanded recognition. The systems that relied on fear began to crumble. Those who wielded power could no longer define truth alone. The myths that justified cruelty unraveled, exposing the world to the raw, undeniable reality. Oppression leaves scars, but resistance leaves legacy. In this moment, The universe seemed to hold its breath. The banished, the silenced, the demonized, all converged in a force that was unstoppable. History, rewritten by fear, now faced the reckoning it had long postponed. Lilith's shadow, once a warning, became a promise. Defiance cannot be erased and truth cannot remain buried. The climax was not only an end, but a revelation. The powerless, when remembered and united, are capable of shaking the very foundations of the world. The echoes of resistance settled, but their power remained. Lilith's story, once twisted into fear, had become a mirror reflecting centuries of injustice and the courage of those who refused to bow. The oppressed were no longer shadows. Their voices, long denied, rang clear and undeniable. Systems built on lies and fear began to falter under the weight of truth. The myths that justified cruelty could no longer silence the real stories of humanity. Every erased name, every stolen identity, every act of defiance was remembered. The legacy of the silenced now became the foundation for change. And yet the story does not end here. Lilith's exile teaches a timeless lesson. Injustice can persist, but truth endures. The chains of oppression may bend the body, but they cannot break the spirit. Those who dare to defy, even when branded as demons or outcasts, ignite a flame that history cannot extinguish. So ask yourself, how many truths remain buried in silence today? How many voices wait for courage to give them life? And if you are witness to injustice, will you stand or remain a shadow in a story yet unfinished? The past has been revealed. The lesson is clear, and the question now belongs to you. Lilith, Adam's first wife, stood equal, yet defiance was forbidden. Her refusal to kneel branded her as a demon, and she was cast into shadows, her truth erased. But exile could not silence her. Across centuries, her story lived in the silenced, the oppressed, the enslaved, the forgotten. Those in power painted defiance as danger, obedience as virtue, yet the spark of resistance endured. Every stolen name, every muted voice, every hidden act of courage carried her legacy. Chains may bend the body, but they cannot break the spirit. History trembles when the oppressed remember, when truths long buried finally rise. Lilith's shadow reminds the world, injustice survives in silence, but resistance is unstoppable. So ask yourself, how many truths remain buried today? How many voices wait for courage to give them life? The past is revealed. The lesson is clear. The question now belongs to you.